Thank you very much for staying up until the last panel. As you said, I'm Elizabeth Muchemi. I'm very pleasantly surprised not to go in the panel right after the Right Honourable, because naturally I went on to ChatGPT to figure out a nice segue into this panel. It gave me Beyonce lyrics. Then I edited again. Then it gave me something about African elders, and I thought, let me stop here before they talk about kintake loss and dowry payments and stuff. So that's another note for ChatGPT to get a bit more African cultural context. But this panel specifically is fully on African context, and it's really looking at how we as African governments can mobilize local capital to finance long-term infrastructure projects. This has obviously been something that's topical. When we look at statistics, only 15% of all of Africa's infrastructure is financed by local capital. South Africa, Egypt, and the likes are definitely trailblazers, and there's something that the rest of Africa can learn from, which is why I'm so pleasantly happy to introduce our star panel, and Ms. Boitumelo Mosako. She is the CEO of DBSA, a leading African DFI and champion of infrastructure investment and regional integration across the continent, and happily also I can say the first female CEO of DBSA. We have Mr. Gain Moore Zanamwe. I hope and I know that he's going to live up to his name, I should say. Director in Trade Facilitation and Investment Promotion at Afrexim Bank, which is also another Pan-African multilateral development bank that has been making exceptional strides at linking intra-Africa trade. And on the line, we have Mr. Clay Lowry, who's dialing in from the US. He is an executive vice president at the Institute of International Finance, which is a global institution which provides thought leadership, policy development for its member parties, which are a mix of commercials and commercial banks and NBFIs. Thank you very much. It's just us. And please join me in welcoming our panelists. First, I'd like to address a question to yourself. As one of Africa's leading DFIs, how do you see the role of DFIs like DBSA in scaling local currency for infrastructure? And should this be a strategic priority? And where do you see the biggest gaps and opportunities?
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. When I look at, for instance, the DBSA, we're wholly owned by the South African government. So we are a national development bank. However, we have a sub-Saharan global reach. So that means we do lend in euros and in dollars as well. So we split 60-40, 60 South African market, 40 outside of South Africa. And for us, local financing is critical. Within the South African context, it's easier because South Africa has deep capital markets, has a vast variety of institutional investors. And so raising money, local currency in South Africa is much, much easier. Now, when we look at the rest of the continent where there's fewer market participants, there are no long-term hedging instruments, and there's less liquidity in local currency. I think that's where the challenges that's where the challenges are. And we have tried, for instance, in other markets, to have a collaboration model from a local currency financing. So we have a relationship, for instance, with TCX that operates outside of the Netherlands, that actually provides hedging opportunities for us to fund. So we work closely with TCX on some of our projects. In one instance, we tried to do a hybrid facility with local currency and hard currency. What actually ended up happening with the local currency elements, having to put in the hedging elements, it ended up being way more expensive. You know, so it becomes less cost effective to actually fund in local currency than in hard currency. So it is a bit of an unfortunate situation, but it is not something that cannot be resolved. And the reason I say this is it is important that between the national development banks, the multilateral development banks, and governments, there is a collaboration and a reform around how to actually develop domestic capital markets on the continent where they are not fully developed. And I think that is the opportunity that is there that we can look at.
Thank you. And then that's a good segue, actually, to gain more, because building on what Boy Tumelo talks about, Afrexim is also very focused on this. And you've focused on it both from bringing in African, I think you call it African development,
Africa direct investment.
Direct investment, that's correct, as a vehicle of harnessing this local currency coming in. But what do you see very similar kind of barriers to cross-border African trade, and what products are you as Afrexim putting together to try and deal with some of these issues that Boy Tumelo has mentioned?
Thank you very much. I think this has always been an important issue for Afrexim Bank. We are your bank, a Pan-African multilateral trade finance institution, and every day what we've always been thinking is how do we put the African continent first, and we know all the issues that have been highlighted from the low level of intra-African trade, which is around 15 to 18%, low levels of industrialization, and even on investment. We've got low levels of investment. And we have been thinking at Afrexim Bank, how best can we actually address this challenge? Because we've got a huge gap in terms of infrastructure, and we then decided to focus more on mobilizing what we call Africa direct investment. And most of you probably are familiar about FDI, foreign direct investment. Yes, it is important, but if you look at the trends over the past, the African continent has actually been getting less of FDI, and I think the recent report by World Investment Forum indicates that we actually received about 53 billion US dollars in 2024. So the trend has actually been not impressive. We then decided to tap into what we call Africa direct investment. What do we mean by this? We actually discovered that there are more Africans that are willing to invest in other African countries. So that is the strategy that we've been working over the past 4 years or so. We actually launched this initiative at the intra-African trade fair that took place in Cairo in 2023, where we discussed even the methodology on how to collect the data for ADI, which is actually not well known. And we found very interesting patterns that some of the countries that were actually topping the list were actually benefiting from investment from some countries like Kenya, investing in some of the countries like Sudan. And these are the trends that we've actually been seeing. And ADI, Africa Direct Investment, is actually likely to be more sustainable in the sense that we've got Africans that are vested. For us as Africa, we don't have another continent to run to when things get bad. So it is actually in our interest to work with the other Africans that are interested in investing in other African countries and provide a whole range of support to mobilize the African resources. We have actually put in place this framework, and we will be launching it at the next Intra-African Trade Fair in Algeria from 4 to 10 September. But what we actually discovered is that there are a range of barriers that actually affect Africa direct investment. Some of them are similar to FDI, but in Africa, what we've actually discovered is that some of the African investors, when they try to invest in other African countries, they are not given the level of respect and treatment that is normally given to foreign investors. And we actually want to change that, and we have also put in place a range of tools. One of them is actually what we call the intra-African trade and investment finance guarantee. This instrument is actually similar to the investment guarantees that are normally provided by multilaterals. So if we've got an African entity in South Africa that wants to, let's say from South Africa, that want to invest in Egypt, we can actually give them those investment guarantees to ensure that they can go and invest in other African countries. And the most important thing is we've brought in a suite of our products to actually back that and support that. One of the probably instruments that you may be aware of is the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. If you look at what is happening is behind any investment, it will actually catalyze trade. But when you try to catalyze trade, you realize that that trade may not be able to happen because you need FX to trade. If South Africa and Egypt want to trade, they now need to probably go and ask for permission from the Oval Office to get the US dollars. From Afreximbank, we're actually saying, as Africans, we don't need to be doing that. We need to be trading in our local currencies. This is where the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System comes in. It will facilitate trading in African currencies, and it will actually help us to save about $5 billion US dollars that is actually being lost in transaction costs. So these are some of the things that we're actually doing to ensure that there's complementarity between Africa direct investment and the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. Coming probably to what my sister was saying, the local currency, we've tried it, and actually in 2017, we actually put in place a local currency program at Afreximbank, which we've been actually trying to implement, and we also issued our first bond in Nigeria in 2020 in local currency. We are now working on getting the assets to try and actually implement that. But some of the challenges you alluded to, we've actually seen that, and also even the pricing aspect is always coming as one of the issues that we've been trying to address. But I think what is probably interesting for us is that we've now decided to find a way of actually dealing with some of these issues. We are now looking at partnering with some of the players that will be doing projects in particular countries. For example, we actually launched a 300 million industrial park in Malawi. And we are going to actually fund that using a mix of local and foreign currency. And that will actually have a lot of positives because we know a number of these countries are also challenged from a probably debt sustainability perspective. So we'll actually use some of the local currency they have to fund some of the things that we can actually buy in and procure in Malawi, and then only bring in the forex element to actually deal with the foreign currency that is required to import any equipment that may be needed to be brought from outside. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll actually touch a bit more on some of the examples that we've seen. But if I could go to Clay online. From a global policy and investor standpoint, what are the most critical reforms do you think that African countries should pursue to deepen local capital markets in order to attract more cost-effective long-term capital? Because I think the points that you've both raised on the pricing is critical. We don't want our governments to start borrowing heavily in local currency and also be experiencing 20, 21% interest rates. So I think, Clay, it would be good to understand any of these kind of reforms you think that can be put in play that may end up having some long-term cost benefits as well.
You, Elizabeth, and thanks very much for the invite, and I apologize that I'm not able to attend in person. And also, I guess, thank you to Standard Bank for putting this together. I was actually on a call this morning with the CEO of Standard Bank, trying to think through actually some of these type of issues for the G20 process that is going on. And I know that this is a conversation about what more is required, as you kind of stated at the beginning. And so, Gainmore actually provided some details, but let me just provide a couple more examples of why this is a very timely type of discussion. So if you look at local currency debt, and local currency debt obviously has played a tremendous role in emerging markets. I mean, a good example of that is just during the COVID crisis, when cross-border flows were just dried up completely. Local currency debt actually helped countries avoid the debt disaster that we all expected. So there was going to be, if you recall back to 2020, we're going to see default after default after default, and that didn't actually happen. I mean, we did have some defaults, of course, but it was, I think, some of the credit goes to the local currency issuers and how they have put together over a long period of time how this can work well for countries. But that being said, if you look at local currency debt around the world, about 40% of it is actually held on average by non-residents of that country. Okay, that's pretty good. However, if you go to emerging market countries, it's actually only 15%, so which is much more significantly lower. So why is that? More needs to be done in order for countries to issue local currency debt that is both attractive to the domestic markets, but also attractive to non-residents. If you look at investment flows, for instance, on clean energy infrastructure, something I know this conference is trying to deal with, they have actually close to doubled in the last 10 years on a global basis to over $2 trillion in investment. But again, using that same number, only 15% of that is going to emerging market countries. This suggests, again, that more needs to be done. So what is that more, as your question asks? Look, I'm right now a giant head on your screen. I do policy and regulatory work. I'm not a practitioner in the markets. But what we do at IIF is we talk to a lot of investors and bankers and insurance companies and pension managers, ask them what are the concerns that they have when they're trying to invest. And they would say a lot of different things, and some of them are the ones that your other speakers have already addressed, and some of your speakers earlier today have addressed. But one thing that they do also talk about is having kind of a sound debt management office practice. So getting the right enabling environment, of course, is vital. Establishing a sovereign yield curve is vital, and putting on, which is an important aspect and a hard thing to do, harder than people think it is. But some other ideas that are out there are, and if you look at research that we've done, actually, is you can actually plot it using econometrics, that if you have sound debt management practices, better investor relation practices, it leads towards greater sovereign credit rating, better and broader access to markets, and maybe most importantly, especially if you're a finance minister, is a lower cost of capital. So a couple of the tricks that we at least have been hearing about are having better clarity of data. So you have better debt management data, better fiscal data, had a better clarity of transparency, particularly when it comes to collateralized instruments, which can be very difficult to understand. This allows for the country and the debt managers to actually put together a debt sustainability analysis and not just be dependent on the IMF. Having a better clarity of a legal. And finally, maybe, and we heard from the Director General from Kenya just right before this panel, and I think he sounds like he gets it, and his team probably gets it very well, which is better clarity of communications, a two-way dialogue. How does a debt manager talk with and relate with investors, both domestically and internationally, with stakeholders, both domestically and internationally, and with credit rating agencies? And so I think that those are some things, and from the sovereign's perspective, that they can do to actually increase and get better investment into their local currency markets and to their sovereign currency markets as well. Why don't I stop there?
Yes, Todd, right. We didn't see her. That's fine, Clay. Don't worry about that.
I apologize. I am actually not where I usually would be working. I'm attending something for a family event.
This is
so I
fine.
apologize.
No worries at all here. I think if I can come back then to you, Boychman, those are some really interesting points, especially on the debt management office and in terms of the transparency of debt. What would you view, for one, has that been also your experience in seeing that as a challenge? And on top of that, what do you think has worked and hasn't worked when you've been looking at local currency financing, both in the rest of Africa, outside of South Africa? And what lessons do you think that the rest of Africa can learn from South Africa? And lastly, any early insights you have with what they call the BRICS local currency credit line agreement that could guide African governments looking to strengthen their own local currency financing?
I think it's very clear. I mean, we've already alluded to what works and what doesn't work. I think for us is to focus on what are the opportunities to actually enhance and drive infrastructure development for the continent. Now, if I look at, for instance, we are part of a community called the Finance in Common. We hosted a summit 2 weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago in Cape Town. We are a system of PDBs. There's more than 530 of us, representing probably 26% of GDPs of the G20 countries. And we actually come together and say, how can we collaborate and what solutions can we develop together to address these issues? Now, when you look at, for instance, with the local currency financing, one of the things that governments need to do firstly is to, not just governments, it's how governments, MDBs, multilateral development banks, and public development banks work together as a system. So there must be investment that is made in the public development banks, because the public development banks are the ones that will provide the risk capital, for instance, that is required for the development of projects, whether it's an infrastructure program, whether it's project preparation. And I'm saying this in the context of what we do as the DBSA for the South African government and the rest of the continent. Because we are a DFI, we have that latitude to put up the risk capital, for instance, in the project preparation funds, so that we can de-risk the project and get it to bankability stage. What that does, then it enables, it catalyzes private sector and institutional capital. Now, the second thing is the opportunity of institutional capital on the continent. I think we probably sit with more than $2 trillion in institutional capital on this continent.
Yes.
Right? And going back to what he was saying is, how do we actually start by mobilizing that capital? And in most cases, that capital is sitting with pension funds, institutions in the respective countries. And we need to make sure that there's proper reforms within countries and supervision of how that money actually develops the country. I mean, currently in South Africa, I think it's a 55-45 split. 45% of those institutional funds can actually be invested outside of the country. Now, I think getting those basic elements right to then say, how do local capital actually support local development? And that's what I think we definitely need to drive. What mechanisms are required to do that? And let's start by doing that. For instance, I'm going to give an example with infra-credit in Nigeria, where it's a credit guarantee fund that was formed to actually enable institutional investors into, to actually participate in infrastructure projects by providing the necessary guarantee. That actually enabled a flow of local currency financing. So those mechanisms are there. Within the South African context, we believe as an institution, we drive investment on a programmatic approach, especially for big programs, whether it's the renewable energy program where we work with our government to refine, to create policy uncertainty, create a program. And within that program, you structure it in such a way that it also provides the protection mechanisms for the investors. Like, for instance, with the renewable program, the offtake was guaranteed or already. It enabled private sector participation with the independent power producer program. And when you look at where the money came from, I think we've invested maybe more than 250 billion in the IPP program. More than 90% of that actually came from local funding. So these things are not necessarily impossible. I think what it takes is intention, willing coalition between governments, between the public development banks and the multilateral development banks. The second thing that I'd like to raise is the role of MDBs. Mm-hmm. Okay, MDBs sit with a lot of, they sit with big balance sheets, okay, and they're designed to, absorb some of these local currency risks. The conversations that we have been having is, as part of these global architecture reform, and unfortunately, the global architecture reform is focused on the MDBs. And one of the things that we are driving for is for the MDBs to actually start funding in local currency and having specific targets for local currency financing. And that's also going to require that we also look at the hedging mechanisms behind that as well. Let me give you an example with the National Development Bank, for instance, the BRICS Bank. One of the things that they've actually started doing as well is they actually started raising money locally. They would raise funds in South Africa to support, South African investments, raising money in Brazil to support Brazil. And when you look at, for instance, the role of the African Development Bank in this context, it is a critical one. And that's why you see the African Development Bank saying, okay, let's partner and create these guarantee funds, for instance, with infra credit in Nigeria. And there is one that we are working on for the South African market as well. These relationships have proven to work, and they've created a lot of funds flows for infrastructure development.
If I could come back with two questions on what you said. Number one is, when we talk about local domestic institutions and financing, sometimes we find that our own domestic institutions seem to have less risk appetite, for example, than for foreign investment portfolios. And in that sense, and our regulators, our local asset managers, local institutions all have a role to play in this. What do you think is, as opposed to parking money in T-bills and in bonds, what do you think can unlock this conservative or more risk-averse stance that a number of regulators and, as a result, local pension funds take? And then secondly, when you talked about MDBs raising money locally, there's been some talk of certain types of very high-rated MDBs, if raising money, for example, in an African country, and they're raising it, expecting to raise it at AAA levels. Local investors thinking, well, hang on, I could just go and buy local paper and more. Why do I want to buy this paper? I'm not getting capital relief, etc. So are these themes that are being discussed now and being workshopped? And it would be lovely to hear your view as well as yours, Gain, more on this.
Okay, no, that's one. I think on our side, how we are seeing it is that when you when you look at these mechanisms, I mean, I do hear what you're saying, and this goes back to the whole perception of risk, that even our own local institutions
Don't like our risk.
you know, have that perception. And I think the way to close that gap is through data. And actually providing the data around what are the default rates when it comes to investment in infrastructure,
Yes.
for instance. And Moody's did do a study on this, and actually for the continent, I mean the default, I think it was one of the lowest.
Yes, and the recovery rates are quite high as well.
It is, you know, low, and I think it's one of those things that we then have to deal with, and making sure that through data you close those gaps. And I think secondly, and you know, with the creation of the guarantee funds as well, because you know it's about biases. I mean, it's the same analogy that lending to women is risky,
Yes.
right? But women are bankable, and actually we honor payments.
We're good
I'm not
debtors.
gonna say we're
I'll say
good at
it.
that, you know. So I think getting these guarantee structures in place, mostly to deal with the biases, can provide comfort to that perception as well. So it's the data element, and it's also about creating these guarantees that can provide. And I think thirdly, really, there must be a mindset shift.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there must be a mindset shift, and that mindset will be driven by the data and the awareness of what it actually means.
Well, thank you. And Gainmore, do you have anything to add on that from Afrexim's experience? Especially you also have guarantee funds and guarantee products that you provide.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I'll start from where she left. I think the starting point is that mindset shift, because when you look at funding in Forex, of course, some will prefer it because they say the rates are more favorable, it's cheaper. But actually, the local currency is what we have, and it should be cheaper. So we need to find a way of making that borrowing in local currency cheaper, and we have been actually looking at a number of options. Of course, the guarantees is one way, because when you look at a project, you now need to put in a number of mitigants to actually make the project bankable. And at Afrexim Bank, some of the tools that we use are guarantees. We've got a range of guarantees, whether it's project finance guarantees, investment guarantees, and we actually try to ensure that even political risk guarantees, there are some people who may be interested in going into a particular country, but they are not probably interested in doing so because of the political risk, the issue of currency convertibility issues. As Afrexim Bank, we actually have got a range of those guarantees that we actually have used, and we actually found it easier when we partner with a foreign investor or an African investor and provide our suites of guarantees. It became actually easier to do some of the projects that would not have taken place. They became actually possible. But I think I want to probably link all these things to probably good project preparation, because I think it was highlighted earlier by the Honorable Minister that the larger problem that we have is lack of bankable projects. And I know my sister is doing a good job in terms of trying to do that, but at Afrexim Bank, we have also set up a project preparation facility to try and ensure that we bring on stream good bankable projects. And then you can then play around with the structuring of those projects. I'll just give you one example of some of the things that we've actually been discussing with our partners. As Afrexim Bank, we are not seeing ourselves just as a lender. We've actually gone to create an equity fund, which we call the Fund for Export Development in Africa, that we now use as our patient equity vehicle to actually take equity in some of the strategic companies like Arise, so that when they go and do a project, be it an industrial park in another African country, we actually follow them with a range of our instruments, from debt, from the risk-bearing instruments, so that when the project is actually being structured, we have also been discussing with them to also involve the locals. If we are developing an industrial park in, let's say, Nigeria, like what we are doing, we have actually requested that the locals also be involved. And one of the issues that we've been discussing is how we can actually involve the locals also through the local currency funding, because these are some of the things that we've been looking at. And we are also doing something similar in a project that we are doing in DRC and Zambia. It's basically on the battery and electric vehicle value chain. Again, working with our partner, Arise, we've done all the heavy lifting from doing pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studying. Preparing those documents is very costly. So we've taken the heavy lift. We are now structuring the project, and one of the things that we are looking at is to actually involve the locals so that they also have a stake in their minerals. They've got these critical minerals that can actually be used in producing battery precursors, batteries for electric vehicles, and 2- 3-wheelers. So when you do it that way, and then you involve the locals to also take equity in the stake, it becomes easier now to bring in the local currency element. These are some of the things that we're actually doing to facilitate this issue. We basically put it under, broadly speaking, what we call African resource mobilization. Whether it's Africans, we've got money, we want to invest in other African countries, we give them comfort to be able to do that. We have also defined intra-African trade and investment to include our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, and we also want to mobilize their funding to put it into well-structured and well-prepared projects that we are preparing. And some of these things, they didn't actually happen overnight. Some of you may be aware that where we actually started from, when we actually realized that we can use African money to solve African problems, is when in 2014, Afreximbank actually came up with a central bank deposit program, which we call CENDEP. We actually started by mobilizing funding from central banks in 2014. And to date, we've actually been able to mobilize about $34 billion from central banks, and we've been using these resources to actually fund African projects. And it became actually cheaper. We managed to reduce our cost of funding by about 70% by relying on resources from central banks. 29 central banks have actually invested in this program, and our outstanding right now is about 8 billion. And what we actually learned from that is that there are more people who are amenable to using their resources by investing in Afreximbank, and then we use it to support those projects, and then we play also around some local currency funding. When you actually do that, you can actually help to create the African capital markets. If we grow and basically develop our African capital markets, we will be able to actually even do some of the long-term funding that is required for big industrialization projects, big infrastructure projects. And if you look at some of the things that we're actually doing, these are some of the things that are important. Thank you very much.
And look, it's clearly a topic in which we can go and have more and more rounds, probably need a half day for it. But I'd like to thank you for these wonderful insights you've had. I think the topics you brought up around the governance, the topics about the MDBs actually having to partner up with each other and find these solutions, find guarantee products, even use the products we already have in country, as you mentioned in Nigeria, and also looking at these interesting ways of structuring projects and either localizing as well as then being a catalyst to provide more local currency financing is fascinating. And Clay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, the signal was going off and on, which is why I couldn't come back to you, but thank you very much for a wonderful panel.